The night was quiet, and the sky was dark and full of stars, and there was no sound except the wind moving through the trees in the forest, and the soft noise of insects hiding in the grass. Ryan was walking alone near the edge of the forest. Because he loved silence and nature, and he liked to be away from the noise of the town and the busy people who never looked up at the sky, he looked up and saw something strange, something bright and fast and glowing blue falling from the sky like a star, but much closer and moving quickly with a burning tail of light. He stopped and stared as the object flew over the hills and crashed into the forest with a loud boom, and a flash that lit up the trees like lightning. Smoke rose in the distance, and Ryan's heart started beating faster, and he knew this was not a normal meteor or a plane, and he felt something calling him to go and see what it was. He ran through the trees following the smoke and the light until he reached a small clearing where the ground was burning and trees were broken, and in the middle there was a strange metal pod half buried in the soil and glowing with heat. It was not like anything he had ever seen before. It looked smooth and silver with strange markings like alien writing, and a soft hum came from inside like a heartbeat. Ryan stepped closer and touched the surface, and it was warm and pulsing like it was alive. And then with a sudden hiss the pod opened, and a soft white light came from inside. He took a step back with fear and wonder in his eyes, and watched as a figure slowly moved inside the pod, and then a girl fell into his arms. She was not human, but she was not fully alien either. Her skin was light purple, and her hair floated like it was underwater, and her eyes were closed but glowing faintly. Ryan looked at her face and saw she was young and beautiful, but also hurt and weak, and something in him said he needed to protect her. He lifted her gently and carried her away from the crash site, hiding under the trees and moving fast because he heard voices in the distance and strange lights coming closer from the sky. When he reached a safe spot near his old shed, he placed her on a blanket and looked at her hand, which was marked with a glowing symbol like a circle with a star inside, and when he touched it, the same symbol appeared on his palm. He gasped and stepped back as the glow faded slowly, and the girl opened her eyes and looked at him and spoke in a soft, broken voice. Words made no sense at first, but then a small device on her neck blinked and started translating, and she said, "Help me, please. They are coming. They will find me, and they will kill everything." Ryan asked, "Who are they? And what do they want? And who are you, and where did you come from?" But she closed her eyes again and whispered, "I am Lyra," and then went silent. Looked around and saw lights in the sky moving in circles, and he knew someone was looking for her, but he didn't know if it was her people or her enemies. The air grew colder and the wind picked up, and Ryan felt the symbol on his hand burn like fire, and the girl's body shook as if she was in pain or danger. He wrapped her in a blanket and sat beside her, wondering what he had just found or what had found him, and what would happen next. Somewhere in the shadows beyond the trees, a red eye blinked and vanished into the dark. Night had changed forever, and Ryan's life would never be the same again. Ryan sat beside the glowing girl, who now lay still under the old blanket, and the cold night wrapped around them like a secret, and he could not sleep because questions kept burning in his mind, and fear kept tapping at his heart like a warning. She had told him her name was Lyra, and she had begged for help, and something about her voice had felt more real than anything he had ever known, and her pain was like a storm waiting to break her. Skin shimmered like moonlight on water, and her breath was soft, slow, and the mark on his palm still glowed faintly, as if it had become a part of him forever and would never fade. Ryan stood up and looked around the forest, but there was no sound and no movement, except the slow dancing of smoke still rising from the crash site, and far away the faint hum of something watching. He went inside the shed and brought water and soft cloth, and began to clean the small wounds on her arms, which had tiny crystals instead of blood, and they flickered when he touched them as if reacting to kindness. Lyra opened her eyes slowly, and her gaze found his with a look of confusion mixed with trust, and she tried to speak, but only broken words came out, and Ryan leaned closer and asked her to speak slowly. She touched the translator on her neck, and it blinked twice, and then her voice changed to clearer English with a soft echo like a song trapped in metal, and she said, "Thank you, human. My name is Lyra. I come from the planet Thalon in the star system Myarian." Listened in silence as she spoke and told him her story, and each word pulled him deeper into a world he had never imagined. She said she was a royal daughter of the Thalons who ruled the crystal realms in peace for many years, but her people were betrayed by a race called the Sharn, who came with black ships and fire in their eyes. The Sharn wanted power, and they wanted a weapon hidden on Thalon, a key that could open destruction across galaxies, and Lyra was born with the map to that key. Hidden in her blood and memory, her parents sent her away in an escape pod during the final attack, with a mission to stay hidden until help came, but the Sharn followed her through the stars and shot down her ship, and she fell to Earth. Ryan could not believe her story, yet somehow he knew she was telling the truth, because nothing about her felt like a lie, and the symbol on his hand told him their fates were now connected. She looked at him with tired eyes and asked, "Why did you save me?" And he replied without thinking, "Because you looked like someone who needed saving." Lyra smiled for the first time, and that smile was not alien. It was just like any other smile, full of warmth and pain, and a wish to be understood. Suddenly, a loud sound cracked through the air, and Ryan grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the woods as lights flashed near the crash site, and dark shapes moved in the trees with weapons in their hands. He hid with her behind a fallen log, and they both stayed quiet while the lights passed, and one of the figures bent down near the smoking pod and spoke in a deep, strange voice that made the trees tremble. Lyra squeezed Ryan's hand and whispered, "They are not humans. They are Sharn in human form. They smell the blood in me. They are close, and they will never stop." Ryan looked into her glowing eyes and saw fear, but also a fire that refused to die, and in that moment he made a choice, without knowing why or how, and he said, "Then we will run, and we will fight, and we will find a way." They moved silently through the woods and reached Ryan's old truck hidden near the edge of the forest, and he helped her inside and started the engine, which coughed and growled, but finally came to life as they drove through empty roads with stars above and danger behind. Ryan asked, "What do we do now?" And Lyra looked ahead and said, "We find a place where they cannot reach us, and then we find those who can help." Ryan did not know where that place was or who would help, but he knew one thing: he was no longer alone, and the stars no longer looked the same. Behind them in the darkness, a black shadow watched and waited and followed without sound. The road ahead was empty and silent, and the old truck moved like a whisper between the trees and the night. Sky watched from above with a quiet warning, and Ryan kept his eyes on the path while his mind ran in many directions. Lyra sat beside him, with her eyes closed and her hand still holding the edge of her seat tightly, and the glowing mark on her wrist was slowly fading, as if it could rest for a while, but not for long. She looked at him and said, "They will come faster now. They know I am alive and close, and they can smell fear and track thought and find even the smallest energy pulse from my body." Ryan asked, "How do we hide from something that can find everything?" And Lyra replied, "We do not hide. We move, and we survive, and we look for a signal point, because if I reach it, I can send a code, and maybe someone will hear, and maybe they will come before it is too late." They passed through an old gas station with no lights and broken windows, and Ryan stopped for a moment to check for supplies, and Lyra stayed close and watched the sky as if it might fall again inside the small store. Ryan found a backpack and some food and water and old clothes, and he brought them out and gave the warm jacket to Lyra, who smiled softly and said thank you again. She looked different in the jacket, like a normal girl lost in a strange world, and Ryan almost forgot she was not from Earth, until her eyes caught the moon, and her voice said, "It is smaller than ours, but still beautiful." They started driving again, and Ryan saw strange lights behind, the trees moving like they had minds of their own, and his heart began to race. And Lyra said, "They are here, and they are changing shape, and they will use the faces of people, Suddenly a figure stepped in front of the truck, and Ryan hit the brakes, and the tires screamed, and the truck stopped just in time, and the figure was his best friend Matt, or someone who looked like Matt. The figure smiled and said, "Ryan, hey man, I have been looking for you, and I know you found something strange and dangerous, and you need to hand it over to the people who understand it." Ryan froze and looked at Lyra, who whispered, "Do not believe it," and Ryan stepped out of the truck and walked slowly to the figure, who kept smiling without blinking. And then Ryan asked, "What did we bury in the backyard when we were 10? Figure paused for a moment and then said, "A box of candy and a comic book." And Ryan shook his head and whispered, "Wrong, we buried a toy plane and a note that said we will fly one day." Before the figure could move, Lyra raised her hand and a wave of blue light burst from her palm and hit the creature, and it screamed, and its face melted into dark skin with no eyes and sharp bones, and it fell back into the woods. Ryan jumped into the truck and drove fast while Lyra said, "That was only one, and many more will come, and some will not speak, and some will fly, and some will burn." They reached an old warehouse near the river, and Ryan parked inside and covered the truck with metal sheets and old cloth, and they sat in silence for a while, trying to breathe again. Lyra looked at him and said, "You are stronger than I thought." And Ryan replied, "I am only strong because you need me to be." And Lyra touched his hand and said, "Maybe that is what makes your kind different. Maybe that is why I trust you." Ryan asked, "How much time do we have?" And Lyra closed her eyes and said, "Maybe hours, maybe less, but I need to recharge, and I need to remember how to open the beacon." He watched her as she slept on the floor, wrapped in the old jacket, and the shadows moved outside the broken windows, and the river made soft sounds like whispers of danger coming near. Ryan looked at the sky through a hole in the roof, and he made a silent promise to protect her, no matter what comes and no matter how dark the night gets. Far away in the forest, a sharn opened its black wings and screamed into the sky, and its voice echoed across trees and hills and reached the ears of others who now turned and followed. The hunt had truly begun, and the world would soon learn that some visitors do not come in peace, and some heroes do not wear armor, but only carry courage in their hearts. The morning came without light, and the sky remained gray and quiet, as if the sun had decided to stay hidden for one more day. And the wind outside the warehouse was slow and cold, like the breath of something old. And watching, Ryan stood near the broken door with his eyes on the trees, and his hands holding a piece of metal pipe, and his heart beating like thunder in a storm. And he knew the peace would not last, because the hunters were near, and silence was not safety anymore. Inside the warehouse, Lyra sat on a stack of crates with her eyes closed and her hands resting on her knees, and small blue sparks moving around her fingers like a memory trying to wake up, and her skin now glowed faintly again, as if power had returned to her. Slowly, like morning mist, she opened her eyes and looked at Ryan and said, "I remember more now." And her voice was soft but filled with something heavy and ancient, like a storm hidden behind calm water. And Ryan walked closer and sat near her without speaking, because he knew what was coming would change everything again. Lyra looked at the ceiling and spoke slowly, and her words painted pictures in the air. And she said, "My people lived in peace for 1,000 years, and our world was covered in light and music and floating cities. But we knew always that others in the dark wanted what we had, and we chose to ignore them and believe that peace would be enough to protect us. Then one day the sky broke open, and the Sharn came not with ships, but with living fire and creatures of black bone and shadow, and they did not speak. They only destroyed, and they tore through cities and minds and memories like they were nothing. My mother was the queen, and my father was the keeper of the core. And they built a weapon long ago, one that could end stars and turn planets into dust, but they never used it, and they feared it more than the Sharn themselves, and they locked it behind codes and blood and memory. I was born with that memory, because my father believed the key should be alive and not written and not stored in stone, and that way no one could steal it without killing their own soul." Ryan listened without moving, and every word felt heavier than the last. And he said, "You are not just a princess, you are the gate." And Lyra nodded with pain in her eyes and said, "I ran not because I am afraid to fight, but because I knew if they take me, they will take everything." She stood and walked toward the small opening in the wall and looked at the slow river outside and said they think I am weak because I left, but they do not understand that sometimes running is the only way to protect what matters. Ryan walked beside her and said, maybe you were not running, maybe you were leading them away, maybe you were saving us before we even knew we were in danger. She smiled, and for a moment the fear faded and her light grew stronger, and she said, maybe that is why I ended up here. Maybe your world was not random, maybe I was meant to find you. Suddenly, the warehouse shook and the sound of breaking metal filled the air, and Ryan grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her back, and something crashed through the roof like a shadow with wings and claws and fire in its voice. It was a Sharn, but not like before. This one was larger and faster, and its skin moved like oil, and its face kept changing like it was trying to find a face Ryan would trust, and it spoke in 3 voices at once. It said, give us the memory and we will leave your planet in peace, and give us the girl and your people will live 1 more century. And Ryan stepped forward and said, I do not believe you, and I never will. The Sharn attacked, and Ryan swung the metal pipe with all his strength, and Lyra raised her hand and sent a blast of blue energy that pushed the creature back, but it came again with rage and hunger, and a scream that cracked the walls. They fought together, Ryan and Lyra, like 2 halves of one fire, and every time the Sharn got close, Lyra blocked, and every time it moved past her, Ryan struck, and their hearts moved as one. At last the creature screamed and vanished into black smoke, and silence returned, but not peace, and Ryan fell to the ground breathing hard, and Lyra fell beside him. With tears in her glowing eyes, she whispered, I cannot run forever, and they will keep coming. And Ryan touched her hand and said, then we stop running, and we start fighting, and we do it together. Far away in the sky, a hidden signal blinked for the first time, and somewhere in the stars something answered. The sun finally broke through the clouds and spread gold across the empty sky, and the birds returned to the trees and sang soft songs that carried no fear and no warning. But Ryan knew peace was never real when the war was still hunting in silence. They had moved from the warehouse before dawn and found shelter in an abandoned train yard where rusted carriages stood like skeletons of forgotten times, and wind whistled through broken windows like whispers of people who once waited but never arrived. Ryan and Lyra sat inside an old dining car where tables were still set and cups still stood, like they had been waiting for someone to return, and Lyra traced her finger along the surface and said, your world feels like it stopped in time, and yet it still breathes. Ryan gave her a small smile and said, sometimes things stop because they are too tired to move but not dead. And Lyra looked into his eyes and said, then maybe I can help it breathe again. While she rested, Ryan walked outside and looked around for signs of danger, and then heard a voice behind him, a voice he knew too well. And when he turned, he saw his neighbor, Mr. Kane, standing beside a black car with 2 men in suits. Mr. Kane waved and said, we have been looking for you, son. Your aunt is worried, and the town has questions, and the crash site is under federal watch, and you need to come with us. Ryan stepped back and asked, how did you find me? And Mr. Kane smiled and said, this old place has cameras and some still work, and you triggered one when you climbed through the gate. The 2 men stepped forward slowly, and one said, we know you are with someone not from here, and we know she is not a threat unless made into one, and we are not here to hurt her, only to understand and protect this planet from unknown risk. Ryan looked at their faces and felt something was wrong, because their eyes never blinked, and their feet made no sound on the gravel, and their smiles never faded. He ran back into the train car and grabbed Lyra's hand and whispered, they found us. And she opened her eyes and asked how, and he said, betrayal. And Lyra nodded and said, it always starts with someone close. They rushed to the back of the yard where an old maintenance shed stood, and Ryan broke the lock and helped Lyra inside, and he said, we need to get far from here now. But the men were already outside the shed, and their voices echoed like thunder in a small cave, and they said, surrender the alien and no one gets hurt, and you have 10 seconds to comply. Lyra touched Ryan's hand and said, if I go, they will not kill you. And Ryan shook his head and said, if they take you, nothing else matters. And she looked at him with something deeper than fear. She leaned close and whispered, "There is something I did not tell you," and Ryan listened as she said, "The key inside me has started to wake, and if they take me, now they will be able to use it, and they will not just destroy my world, they will destroy yours too." Ryan asked, "Why now?" And Lyra said, "Because the moment I trusted you, the memory opened, and it believes you are the chosen one who can protect what my people died to hide." Before he could speak, the door exploded and smoke filled the shed, and Ryan grabbed Lyra and they ran through the side exit into the trees where light and shadow danced like soldiers at war behind them. The two men changed form and their suits melted into black skin and their faces stretched into shapes not made for Earth, and their hands turned into long weapons of bone and energy. Ryan and Lyra kept running and reached a small bridge where an old pickup truck waited, and inside was a man with a scar across his cheek who nodded at Ryan and shouted, "Get in now, if you want to live." They jumped into the back and the truck sped off through mud and fire, and the creatures chased them through the forest, tearing through branches and screaming in voices not meant for the living. Man drove without fear and said, "Name is Rook, used to work with signals, now I work with survival, and your princess is on every radar from here to the moon, and maybe beyond." Lyra looked at Ryan and said, "Your kind still surprises me." And Ryan smiled and said, "We are not easy to break." As the truck vanished into the horizon, the Sharn stood at the bridge and watched the smoke rise, and one of them touched the ground where Lyra had stood and whispered, "She is changing, and the weapon is waking, and the human is now part of it." Above the trees, a hidden drone blinked and sent a signal to a ship waiting beyond the sky, and inside the ship something ancient opened its eyes and smiled. Without lips, asterisk. The truck raced across dry land and dust followed like a tale of warning, and behind them silence stretched wide and dangerous like a trap waiting to snap, and Ryan held tight to the side while Lyra sat beside him with her eyes locked on the road ahead. Man named Rook drove like someone who had nothing to lose and everything to protect, and his hands never shook even when fire lit the sky behind them, and strange shadows moved in the clouds like hunters with wings and teeth. Ryan asked, "Where are we going?" And Rook said, "To the edge of the world, or close enough, a place where signals die and machines forget how to listen and men remember how to fight." They passed broken towns and empty roads and fallen towers covered in vines and silence, and it looked like the world had already ended in these parts, and maybe only the wild still believed in survival. At last they reached a metal gate half buried in the ground, and Rook tapped a code into a small box, and the gate groaned open like it had not been touched in years, and inside was a tunnel full of rust and shadows. They drove in, and the gate closed behind them, and the light vanished, and only the sound of the engine filled the space until they reached a large underground chamber full of old screens and strange machines and people moving with purpose and fire in their eyes. Rook stepped out and said, "Welcome to Station Echo, the place where forgotten things become sharp again." And Ryan looked around and saw men and women in worn clothes, but with minds full of plans and hearts ready for war. Lyra looked at a large round table in the center where a map of stars floated in the air, and her face changed, and she said, "This is not Earth technology." And Rook smiled and said, "We found it in pieces over the years, and your crash just made the puzzle complete." Ryan asked, "Who are you people, and why are you helping us?" And a woman stepped forward with metal arms and a voice like thunder in a bottle and said, "Because we are tired of running, and we believe humanity is not small. It is just quiet before the storm." Lyra walked to the map and pointed at a red mark glowing near the edge and said, "This is where the beacon must be placed if we want my message to reach the resistance. And if we wait too long, the key inside me will finish unlocking and they will track it. No matter where we hide." Rook nodded and said, "Then we move now, and we move fast." And Ryan asked, "What about the weapon?" And Lyra said, "If I fall into their hands, it activates, and if I stay close to you, it stays asleep, and maybe that is why it chose you. Maybe your heart keeps it calm." Ryan looked at her and said, "Then you are staying close no matter what." And she smiled with eyes full of starlight and pain and hope all at once. They moved through the tunnels and prepared for the mission, and Ryan was given a vest with small lights and a device that hummed when near danger, and Lyra placed a crystal inside his pocket, and said it will protect you if you believe it can. As they left the base, the sky above had turned gray again, and wind carried the smell of metal and storm, and the mountains in the distance looked like giants sleeping with one eye open. They reached the signal point, a tall tower built from scraps and old satellite parts, and climbed to the top, where Lyra placed her hands on a glowing core and closed her eyes, and the wind stopped moving. Suddenly, the ground shook, and the Sharn appeared not from the sky this time, but from the earth itself, like shadows pulled from the bones of the planet, and they came with silence and fire, and Hungerrook and his team opened fire, and the air filled with light and sound and death, and Ryan stood in front of Lyra with his arms raised, and the symbol on his hand began to shine like a sun that had not yet risen. Lyra whispered, "The message is almost out. Do not let them reach me." And Ryan shouted, "I will not fall, not now, not ever." And his voice carried through the storm and through the fear and through the noise of war. The Sharn pushed forward, and one leaped at Ryan with claws raised, but a shield of light blocked the attack, and the crystal in his pocket cracked and sent a wave of force that threw the creature back into dust. Lyra screamed as the final part of the signal left her hands and rose into the sky like a shooting star and vanished into the clouds, and then she fell to the ground with her eyes closed and her breath fading. Ryan caught her and held her close and said, "Stay with me. We are not finished." And somewhere high above the clouds something blinked and turned its gaze toward Earth. Ryan held Lyra in his arms as the sky above turned red and silver, and the wind roared with the cry of machines and creatures, and the tower behind them burned with silent fire while the signal flew far beyond the clouds and into the stars. Her skin was cold, and her light was fading like a star at the end of its life, and Ryan whispered to her again and again, saying, "Stay with me, stay with me. Please do not go, not now, not after all this." She opened her eyes slowly, and her voice was weak like wind trapped in glass, and she said, "The signal is sent, the stars have heard us, now we wait." And Ryan said, "I do not care about the stars. I only care about you." And she smiled with pain and love and something older than time. Below them, the ground shook, and the last of the Sharn gathered near the tower with their weapons raised and their eyes burning with hunger, and they began to climb with rage in their limbs and death in their mind. Rook shouted from below that they could not hold them much longer, and his voice was broken with fire and dust and the scream of a man who knew he would not see another dawn, but would fight like it was his. First Ryan looked down at the creatures, and then at Lyra, and then at the symbol on his hand, which now glowed like a sun reborn, and he felt something move inside him like a door opening and a memory that was not his. Lyra whispered, "The weapon is awake now, but it listens to you, not them. It listens to your heart and your will and your choice. You must choose what kind of flame it becomes." Ryan stood up with Lyra beside him, and she placed her hand on his chest and said, "You are more than human. Now you are the lock and the key and the voice that commands the fire." The sky split open above them, and from the darkness came a ship of light, shaped like a star with wings and eyes, and it hovered in silence as beams of gold rained down upon the battlefield, and the Sharn looked up and screamed without sound. From the ship came voices not in words but in feeling, and Ryan understood them like dreams remembered, and they said, "We heard the call, we are the last of Fallon, we come for the princess and the protector." Ryan looked at Lyra and said, "Go with them. They can heal you, they can take you home." And Lyra shook her head and said, "This is my home now because you are here, and you made me believe in something more than survival." Tower began to fall, and Ryan raised his hand, and the light from his palm turned into a wall of force that held the tower in place and pushed the Sharn back, and Lyra held his other hand and added her own strength, and together they stood like the last hope of a tired world. Ship above sent a beam of healing into Lyra, and her strength returned, and her glow brightened, and her eyes cleared, and she said, "I know now what the weapon truly is. It is not death, it is choice. It is light that destroys darkness only when called by love." Ryan nodded and said, "Then let it be love," and the light around them exploded into every color and wave and sound, and the Sharn turned to ash, and the sky cleared, and the tower stood whole again. The Ship landed softly, and from it came beings of light who bowed to Lyra and spoke her true name and said the core is safe. The messages received, the war can end and peace can begin. Lyra looked at Ryan and said, I was born to carry destruction, but I choose to carry life. And Ryan said, I was born to be small, but now I feel as wide as the stars and as strong as the sky. They stood together as the wind carried away the dust, and the broken earth healed under their feet, and the trees began to sing again, and far in the distant cities woke with a new morning. Lyra asked, what happens now? And Ryan said, we live and we learn, and maybe we love. And Lyra smiled and said, then let that be our story, not of war, not of fear, but of love that crossed stars and fire and silence. She kissed him under the soft light of the returning sun, and for the first time since the crash, there was no fear in the air, only hope. The stars above blinked gently as if watching with quiet pride and deep peace, and the ship rose, again ready to leave but waiting for a choice. Lyra looked up, then looked at Ryan and said, I stay. And the galaxy listened as a new legend was born.